Hey, folks, thanks for joining me for this episode from the Embellish Podcast. If you got here by chance, please take a moment to hit the subscribe button. Hopefully, I can be found on any podcasting platform that exists. And if you can't find me on a platform, send me an email at embellishpod@gmail.com and I'll try to get that taken care of. You can also find video versions of this podcast on YouTube. You can find all of my links on Instagram at embellishpod or TikTok with the same handle. I have a website. It is www.embellishpod.com. It's a place to pick up these links, episode details, and more. Today, I have Dr. Don ONeal from New Dawn Distilling joining me. And this is a phenomenal conversation about what I think is going to be a pretty significant brand in the marketplace. So hopefully you guys have a fun time listening to this because I sure had a fun time recording it. This morning, this afternoon, this evening, whenever you happen to be consuming this podcast, I have Dr. Don ONeal joining me from New Dawn Distilling. And Dr. ONeal, if you would, kind of give us the long and short of who you are and then what New Dawn is.
Yeah, definitely. I'm Dawn, and feel free to call me Dawn, by the way. Dawn ONeal. I started New Dawn Distilling. Let's see, it'll be a year in June with our release of our 6-year-old New York bourbon, and then we did a 10-year release November of last year of a 10-year weeded whiskey. Have had a long, winding journey getting into distilling. My background is heavy in the conservation ecology era, and that's what shapes my company. I am all about sustainability, making sure that we are doing right by the environment, by our communities. I would say my more recent tagline is "No bathtub gin." I'm not looking forward to the time when we can't have wonderful, high quality whiskey. So I'm trying to do what I can to save the environment.
So the motto behind the brand is "with intention from grain to glass." How does that fit into the brand's philosophy, like the creation of it?
Yeah, so for me, that means looking at the entire supply chain from when we are sourcing our grains, we're doing local, we're doing organic, to our distillery in New York. No additives going in. We're using well water, which means we're not putting pressure on the water supply chain. We're using recycled bottles. We're looking for ways to break down or reduce shipping costs. I say both costs and the distance things are traveling. It's like all the way through the entire supply chain, intentionally trying to choose actions that will do right by the environment. And I really say do right by our communities, because I'm in New Orleans. So often down here, you have industries that set up and they are doing terrible things to the communities surrounding them. And so where I can, I like to be able to support. And for me, if it's not happening in my business, that means I'm investing outside for those things to happen. So we donate 1% of our proceeds to environmental organizations, particularly those around environmental justice.
So, and that's a good way to kind of pivot into kind of talking about your background, right? Because you have a winding and circuitous path that kind of brings you into distilling specifically, and I'll kind of we can touch on at one point you were a part of the Audubon group, and I grew up with the little white book. In
Oh,
every single household in our family of birds, right? Like my grandparents, my parents, my aunts, everyone, that was like the Christmas gift. And so we grew up as bird watchers, trying to figure out what you're going to see here in Western Kentucky. So when I came across that, I was like, oh, it's interesting, and it's also a first, right? So how do you get from there to here?
yeah. Well, you start out with, I will say, a family, particularly my dad, who wants to get you outdoors. And so for me, I love being outside. You'll see, if you follow us on any of the socials, I'm always in a boat, kayaking with my dog, on a hike and everything, just being outside. And so being outside was like, how can I make that into my life, my job when I was a kid? I thought I was going to be a marine biologist. My mother had different thoughts. She wanted me to be an engineer. Our compromise is that I went to Washington University in St. Louis that had a good biology program. She did not make me aware that they also had a good engineering program. So but when I was, if you could be farther away from an ocean or a
Mhm.
big body of water, it would be St. Louis. And then I actually got into birds. And so I thought I was going to go and be a biologist. I didn't really know what I was going to do with, like, I was just like biologist, didn't really know what to do. And then I did a research experience for undergraduates, actually at Mountain Lake Biological Research Station over in Virginia near Blacksburg. And I wanted to work with the lizard people, but they put me with the bird people. I have more recently come to understand birds are dinosaurs, so close enough. And I just never looked back. And I will always say that until I got married, I was like, I'm not an ornithologist. I'm not a birder. I just studied the dark-eyed junco, which is this gray bird, white belly. You see it a lot in the winters and everything. But I don't know anything about birds. And then I got married, and my husband was like, "What's that? What's that?" And I was like, "I don't know. It's not a junco." And then I had to learn all the birds. Ended up at the National Audubon Society through a path that took me through conservation. And that's where I really sort of begun to understand, what does it mean to be a biologist and ecologist? How do you put that into everyday practice? How are we making sure that our communities are able to enjoy the environment? Like, I was a little kid growing up in Cleveland, Ohio. It's not where you thought you would go for skiing and canoeing and whatever, but I was able to do those things because somebody well before me made sure those spaces existed. And so at some point in time, I had the thought, I love bourbon. How do I combine these two things together? And so
Mhm.
that's where I want to be able to show people, here's how you're able to, do things for the environment through the things you love.
So, and you mentioned conservation, and conservation can be a weird place, right? Where you've got the group of people that have the gun racks in the back window of their truck and that are conservationists, and then you've got the Tiva hikers that are conservationists, and then there's this really wide gambit that kind of goes between those two. And one end of the spectrum leans into the whiskey culture, right? If you were to look at it
Yeah.
from a very stereotypical lens, and the other end maybe not so much. So how do you just said you knew you loved bourbon. How did you come to bourbon, right? Because you're in Ohio, you're in St. Louis. These, if we run on back on our timelines, these weren't necessarily meccas of bourbon at that point in time. So how did you come to bourbon?
Yeah. So I came to bourbon through graduation, or not graduation, through graduate school
Mhm.
at Indiana University, which I will say in Bloomington, which is like a beautiful place to be in its proximity to Kentucky and Tennessee and whatever good deals you get over in Ohio and whatever you want to call it. So Bloomington, Big Red is where we used to shop, and they would just have an amazing selection of your regulars as well as your craft whiskey. And I fell in with a group in my graduate, a bunch of nerdy biologists who were into bourbon, and they sort of helped open the door to me, introduced me to a whole lot of really amazing bourbons. I remember the first bourbon I brought to the table was Wild Turkey's Tradition. And I didn't know anything really about bourbon. I just went to the store and I was like, I'm going to this tasting event. I need to bring a bottle that won't embarrass me. And that was when I, like, the guy was like, well, what do you like? And I was like explaining, here's what I like, so what I know I like so far. But I was like, but also it doesn't matter. Just don't embarrass me.
Mm.
And so that's really how I got into whiskey and everything. But I will say, conservationists are big. Like, yes, you've got your gun toting, your traditional that are known for drinking whiskey and everything,
Mhm.
but the other side of conservationists, your hikers, your, I don't know, gala event people, they are also really big whiskey drinkers,
Mhm.
really big whiskey drinkers.
And you had a perfect time to trying to be, getting into whiskey, at least in the United States, because if I put my hat on, we were talking about kind of, how old we both were before I started recording. And if I think, a traditional timeline for going to school, about the time you'd be in grad school, there was a whole lot of really good whiskey available,
Yeah.
that now is, secondary market gems that you could, maybe pay off a house with if you still had some of those things.
Right.
Um, floating around. And so you were able to kind of, expand out there. And so if I'm putting pins on the map here, and I'm understanding where Dawn came from, there's Ohio, there is St. Louis, there's Indiana, there's Virginia, and there's ultimately New Orleans. And so you're creating this, what has got to be an amazing flavor profile and palate. But we'll kind of move to that in a little bit. So you're hanging out with a bunch of whiskey nerds that are also conservation nerds. Did you ever kind of get past that? In grad school, I want to buy a bottle. Basically, you don't want to show up with the equivalent of box wine
Right.
at the party, right? You're trying to be respectable. When did you try to transition into feeling like, all right, I know something about whiskey now, kind of like you did with birds? Whenever you're like, all right, I got to learn about birds now. I'm not just the one. I got to know the rest of them.
I would say lots of study. So both that we used to have our tastings and people would bring their various bottles. But as you said, where I was, really great time to be getting into whiskeys. And there would be a lot more, I would say, local tastings, if you will, that
Mhm.
would bring in people from all over. So we used to go up to Indy, and I won't remember the name of the store, but they would I felt almost like quarterly or something like that. They would do these huge whiskey tastings and everything. And I would get, like, just being able to like taste your way through, because they would be bringing in again those craft distillers. I I know I one of my most embarrassing memories is telling the master distiller from Jack Daniels at the time that his Gentleman Jack smelled like barnyard. Because by the time I made it to his table was at the end, I was super drunk.
Mhm.
Because they would just be like, and it really was. It would be like they would be ridiculous tastings, yet at the same time, because you had that variety in front of you, and if you went back, like you'd be like, okay, I've tried this one before, I kind of liked it. So let me, as a like last time I started from the beginning, this time I'm gonna start from the end. You know what I
Mhm.
mean? And to be able to taste around. And so I would probably say I got my PhD in 6 years. And I would say for me, but the end of, so 6 years after getting in and having tasted my way through so many different whiskeys and bourbons, etc., that's when I felt comfortable. But I really won't say that I felt like I arrived until, I started telling people after I left my group of whiskey drinkers, yeah, I'm really into whiskeys and everything. And people would be like, oh, so like wild turkey or whatever. And I'd be like, what? No. And like some random craft brand or whatever, I'd be like, I don't even think you understand what I'm talking about. And I will say this: I remember distinctly, I had a job as my first job out of graduate school, working for a small land trust, and they had an education program. And so they were like, we're going to announce Dawn's arrival. And I was like, tell us 3 things about you. And I'm like, I'm really into whiskeys and bourbons. And they were like, well, we don't think that we should put that down there for an educator. But again, it was because they didn't realize, like, kids, I have a collection. Like,
Right.
what are you talking? Like, you don't understand. We're not talking about getting drunk. We're talking about refined palate, consuming, responsibly and all of that, and really getting into the flavors.
Yeah, I mean, and if you just said I was really into wine, they would have probably had a very different
Right?
view at that point, right? Because and
Exactly.
we've all done some good work in trying to change the stigma around what a whiskey aficionado is about. It's not just like closeted alcoholism, right? It's really like there's a hobby, there's flavor profiles, there's a lot
Mhm.
of communality to it. So you finish your PhD and you're kind of moving into your career. Does whiskey play along the entire time, or does it sort of sit in the back, or like are these parallel things?
So I never, well, I shouldn't say never. I always thought that, if you will, starting a brand, or really start at the time, starting a distillery was an end goal.
Hmm.
So it's like, go out, make your living, retire, start your distillery. That's what I thought. And so, like, when I moved to New York, it was probably the farthest that I had ever been from sort of whiskey land, though there is really strong whiskey culture. And that was when I started getting into these like New York whiskeys, which very early on I was not. I was like, there, I'm sorry, no. I will say. I really did. I was like, I don't know what's happening here, but this is not good whiskey. And, lamenting being back in Indiana and everything and so close to, all of the beautiful whiskeys that we got a chance to try. But it was really for me like, oh, this is going to be an end goal. And it really wasn't until I started working at the National Audubon Society that I really started thinking these two things can come together. I was talking to some friends, and we were essentially getting into the fact that like whiskey is such a great vehicle for educating people about the environment and like why you should care. So it's like we could talk about trees, we could talk about oaks and their decline and how we really need to be, water, soil, not cutting down the trees so that we can have oaks, so we continue with our barrels. We can talk about the grain and everything and how we, again, need strong agricultural in place so that we can have all of these wonderful grains that provide the flavors and everything. We talk about water and all of that. And so rather than like boring you with like, this is how a water system works and whatever, I can be like, all right, let's pick up this glass of whiskey.
Right.
Think about it, how it tastes. What are the flavors that are coming out of here and everything? Now think, if you weren't able to get the barley, what are you replacing it with in order to get that, rich malted molasses flavor and everything? And if your corn crops are not coming in very strong, like what are we doing for bourbon? Like, you know what I mean? Like, and that's why I feel like at some point I was like, I feel like I could just make much bigger impact going this route of conservation than the more typical like education, save the elephants and
Mhm.
whatever.
Yeah, and it's I mean it's definitely an interesting angle. I've kind of been on the side of, you can parallel the concept of the growth of whiskey in the United States to the industrialization of the nation, or even the industrialization of the farming process, right? Because
Yeah.
most distilled spirits were, an on-farm way to preserve your grain, and then as you were able to create even more and more grain, then you needed to be able to create even more and more of a way to store it, because long-term grain storage didn't exist, and so now you got to industrialize the whiskey alcohol portion of the equation, and it just kind of parallels the United States. But using it as a pivot point to talk about conservation is really interesting, because it is widespread. There's very few products, I think, that probably go from one end of the conservation spectrum to the other end, because there's impacts to local ecologies. There's what do you do with stillage, right? Because that's an ecology
Yep.
kind of impact. And I said a lot of things. Now I have one, maybe a little bit of a weird question, right? So your mom wanted you to go to school to be an engineer, and as you think about starting a distillery, you're effectively becoming a physical engineer of a product, right? Because the distilling process is chemical engineering, the production process is production engineering. Like, has she finally been like, "Oh, look, sweet, this paid off," or how do they feel about this?
Well, unfortunately, my mother passed away 2 years ago before I started this. But I will say, without her passing and sort of having that thought too, life is too
Mhm.
short, I might not have made the leap. That was definitely something that played into it. I would, since I don't distill directly, I work with
Mhm.
distillers just because for me, and maybe I will change 100%, but for me right now, the thought, like I'm like, I like to know what I'm doing. And I would be like, oh my God, I got to go back and get another degree in distilling. And
Mhm.
why would I do that when there are experts out there that I can say, here's the flavor profile I'm looking for and everything. How do we get to that flavor profile? Learn what I can from them and everything. So
Mhm.
that, like, sipping, tasting, blending, and all of that, as opposed to being like, all right, let me go back and get a degree in distilling and figuring out like, because there's such like I just don't sometimes I don't think people realize like the skill involved there. And I say that because that there are people who distill in their backyards and whatever. And I'm not saying that no, I'm saying that if you're distilling in your backyard, you perhaps do not have the skill. Maybe you have the family history that has
Mhm.
been passed down for sure. But when it's your day job, that's what I mean. When it's your day job, that's when you are really, I'm doing this every day. I'm getting better at this. I'm starting to note the nuances. One of the reasons why I really like working with Alton is because they aren't quite as industrialized yet. And so I shouldn't say yet, I hope never. Still very small craft. And so they're still tasting to tell
Mhm.
when you've got your hearts are coming out and everything, as opposed to like, let's test this in a chemistry. And so they really are like, still holding on to those sort of ancestral notes, while at the same time I feel like it's more of like this song celebration of the skill of being able to do that. Like I'm not there yet for
Mhm.
sure, so I'm relying on the experts to help me out here.
And you're definitely not wrong. My dad homebrewed beer for 20 years, but going into commercial beer production facility, he's like, no, this is not a thing. There's an economy of scale. There's a different
Yes,
level of decision making and education that goes into
consistency.
play. Like if you make a mistake on a 5-gallon bucket of beer, it's really not a big deal. If you make a mistake on 500 gallons of distillate, it's a much
Yes.
different deal, right? But you touched on this just a second ago a little bit, and a lot of people have these dreams of starting a spirits brand, whether it be from going in their backyard or just this journey that you sort of created. And you mentioned you did take the leap, and part of the reason why. But what was the decisive moment or the realization that transformed from a retirement dream to now?
Yeah, so I had a professional coach at the time because I had moved to, so I'd started at National Audubon Society. I moved from upstate New York, where I had been at the time for 10 years, to New Orleans. And it was like brand new, like very large staff, brand new community, etc. And I was like, I need an outside person to help get me out of my head, is
Mhm.
essentially like that. Like, and and I want to say like, and almost like a peer, so you can be like, okay, is this right? How do I do better about connecting this? Let me talk through these things. And she actually coached me out of my position, Latrice, because like I would have like if I would have angst, or I'd be stressed, or she does this analysis, it's called the Berkman, and I realized that there were some things that were missing from my time at Audubon and working in conservation that I didn't have, that I had it really enjoyed from a research side of things. So there's a lot of creativity involved there. And you were like choosing a question, then figuring out how to answer that question and all of that. And I wasn't getting the same level of creativity working in conservation that I was at the research side of things. I wasn't having the same ability to sort of like, I would like challenge myself, if you will. You could say I rose too fast and I got to the top and I was like, oh, well, I don't know if this is exactly what I want. And so she asked that question, that age-old question, what would you do if money and other people's opinions didn't matter? And I've been asked that question forever and ever, but she like pushed me. And I was like, well, I'd open a distillery and, travel the world and whatever you want to call it and figure out how to distill a bunch of different things and all that because I like am really fascinated by it. And she's like, so what's stopping you from doing that right now? And I gave my excuses, and then I started thinking about it. And then I had a friend who started a tequila company. And
Mhm.
if you know anything about tequila, nobody starts a tequila distillery. You don't do that. You go down to tequila, you meet with a bunch of wonderful distillers, and you decide this is the product that I think best reflects me and my values, the product and the people, and you start your brand. And I was like, can you do that with whiskey? That sounds amazing. And especially because I like the idea of being able to go to a bunch of different master distillers and be like, hey, let's work together. Like that was a challenge. That was a creativity. Like we don't always have to be putting out the same thing and all of that. And so I started looking into it and I was like, oh, you can. And then it was over because it was a thing that wouldn't go out of the back of my mind. I was like, I think I got to pursue this right now.
Mhm. And you mentioned you're partnering with Alton right now. Um, what did you just kind of luckily stumble into them at the beginning, or did you have to go through a series? Like, what's the journey to finding the partner that you currently have?
Yeah, so MHW, which is a distributor, they have this brand arc program. The brand arc program is fantastic. It's led up by Ian Perez. He is amazing. And I say that because in my case, what I did before I, found the people is I wrote an entire brief of what I wanted. out of my offerings. I was like, I want them to taste like this. Like, and it included the conservation, the intentional side of things. I'd like for there to be local grains. I'd like for it to be organic or regenerative. I'd like for the distilleries to be working in partnership with community, etc. Then I want it to taste like this. I always joke now, I had no weeded whiskeys because I hated them. And then what happened? I put out a weed
Mhm.
and all that. So I put all this complete brief together. And then when I ended up, deciding, okay, I'm going to go with the brand ARC program, because there were some other consultants out there and all of that. But I liked that the brand ARC program, when I met with Ian, first and foremost, our first conversation when I was like, I really would love to work with, farmers who are doing regenerative agricultural practices, which are practices that essentially put back into the environment and everything. So it's like the step above organic and everything. And I don't need it to be certified organic or certified, but people who are thinking along those lines. And Ian is this Irish dude, and he was like, you are the first person I have heard use the words regenerative agriculture since I came from Ireland. And I was like, what? And then he just geeked out with me. And I was like, oh,
Mhm.
you are my partner right here. You understand what I'm talking about. And so
Mhm.
Ian went out and he essentially looked for, and I thought he was going to come back with like a small pot that would fit with this super specific brief. But I ended up having 16 whiskeys to try. And so he
Mhm.
sent me 16 different whiskeys from different distilleries and everything. And I just tasted my way through them multiple times, pulled together some friends and family, tasted again, and then narrowed it down to my top three.
So, going through this process, I'm quite sure um, there's a lot of really established paths to market, right? And how you get there. And people are not shy on giving you advice or direction, wisdom, you might even say.
Yes.
Um, and I'm not gonna ask about the wisdom that you took and you're like, "Yeah, I'm gonna use that." I wanna know, like, is there some wisdom that was shared with you that you intentionally chose to ignore when you set out to build New Dawn?
I will say, so I intentionally ignored people who said you should just start in one market. They were just
Mhm,
like, oh, you say, because I remember going to the table and I was like, my opening markets, I want them to be New York, DC, online, and then Louisiana. And I'm still looking for a distributor for Louisiana, but I was like, those are my markets and everything. And also online being a like market in its own right. That was
yeah,
another thing. I was like, whatever, I don't care, kids. I'd like, how do I get my stuff to as many people as possible? And I am very intentional about not spreading myself too thin,
mhm,
but also about essentially saying, where are the people who want my stuff? And let's go ahead and make that leap. And I will say that I think that both at the quality level of my whiskeys and the price point, to be honest, that there is the part where I'm like, I am not going to end up in every single bar, restaurant, and liquor store in, we'll say, DC, for example, and everything. It's not going to happen. I like they're I'm not Beyonce, if you will, where everybody ran out and bought. They're not going to do that. For me, it's going to take time. And so instead, I've been sort of trying to focus on, here are these niche markets in those places, cover that niche market, which might be small, and then move to the niche market and somewhere else. And I think that that's a completely different way of thinking about it.
mhm,
But I would say it comes a little bit from where I was in Bloomington, Indiana, because I've lived a lot of places. I went Indiana, Georgia. I've lived in the DMV area. Nobody, nowhere else I have lived, has had the whiskey selection that we got in Bloomington, Indiana. And
mhm.
and that was again during that time, and no one in their right mind would be like, let me put Bloomington, Indiana as a place for me to have a whiskey market. You wouldn't do that. But I remember having all of that selection. And so everywhere I go, and I'm like, where the hell is the selection? So that's where I'm like, I'm looking for those people, the ones who are like, I need new things. I need
Mhm.
them often and whatever. And I want them to be premium, high quality.
Yeah, and I think the benefit of brands like yours, is that you get into almost a vintage concept, right? Where it's not
Yes.
the exact same product over and over again, it's what you're curating, and, you're describing a whole lot of intentionality in what you're doing, whether it be from the markets that you kind of explore or how you put together your packaging, right? And so, I was listening to the conversation that you had with Jack. Jack's one of my friends.
Yeah.
I've been able to sit in his basement and break bread, and it was a fantastic experiment. But you prominently, you tie your identity directly to this bottle, right? It's got your name on it. It's got that this is a Black woman owned brand, and you mentioned that it connects into this like code switching and in conservation that you had to deal with. What does it feel like to bring your full identity forward in this venture?
I would say amazing because I wasn't able to do that in all of my previous iterations and everything. I always joke with because my name is Don ONeal, and I always joke and well, actually, true story. When I was going to undergrad, my roommate, we talked on the phone. At the time, there was no video calls, whatever. This
Mhm.
is back in the day, kids. Talked on the phone. She thought I was going to be a redheaded Irish girl, and I was like, "What?" Just because of my name and all of
Mhm.
that. And so for me, it's always been this sort of life of, oh, you don't show up as exactly as we thought you were going to be, or that I am, dialing it down, if you will, to fit in. And so now I don't like we were talking before we started. You were like, you don't have to worry about swearing and all of that. And I was like, and I told you you couldn't stop me if you tried. And I like literally like I feel like in middle school I was bullied. And I didn't know how to do the slang and whatever you want to call it. So to like get out from under the bullying for sounding like a nerd, I started swearing. So I've been swearing since middle school, kids.
Mhm.
Okay, it's I again that educator or that first time educator, outstanding in this land trust, whatever, leading this class of fifth graders. Do you know my very first day I swore in front of them all? Yes, I did because taught me. And so I greatly appreciate that I am now my own business adventure, my own, company, how I show up authentically myself all the time, swear like a sailor, don't take it personally, everything. I've been doing it since middle school and
Mhm.
everything. And that feels amazing. And if anything, I think it makes it so much easier connecting with people, like as it relates to, hey, try this. And it's always unexpected. Literally nobody, yeah, my name is Don ONeal. Yeah, whoops. Well, it says Black owned, so we know she's not a redheaded Irish girl. But you're still gonna be surprised
Mhm.
that cast strength bourbon, you know what I mean, coming out coming out of New York, which you're not really thinking, all right, New York is the place to go for some really rich and real depth. You're thinking this should be
Mhm.
Kentucky bourbon. That's how I felt. I was like, this is New York. Did I mislabel my samples and whatever? And so yes,
Mhm.
I just like showing up full self. It's all I want to be able to do. And I think that shows also in the whiskey that I'm offering.
Yeah, and as a lifelong resident of the state of Kentucky, I absolutely enjoy the different layers with which this particular offering challenges norms, right? Because it is New York whiskey, that is, um, on par with everything else that's out in the marketplace at a higher level. It is female owned, and it is, Black owned, right? Those are all things that are not necessarily the norms. And so
Yeah.
whenever you say you're going to cast this really, really broad net, makes a lot of sense, right? Because, um, not being able to, let's just say you came into my particular market, Western Kentucky, primarily white, primarily male driven market, might not resonate with that. So you're going to want to cast a much bigger net and make sure you
And I
get
want to be
your.
like, yet, because you just have to get to
Yep.
the point where it's like everybody is like, have you tried this? This is amazing.
Yep.
Whatever. It says Black woman owned. She knows what she's talking about. You know what
Yeah.
I mean? Like
Yeah,
that's
without a
that's where
doubt.
I'm
And
headed.
that's the be all end all goal is that it doesn't matter I mean, it does matter, right? It doesn't matter who owns it,
Yeah,
but it does matter because if we can have this really, really broad range of personalities that are generating flavor profiles, we get so many more different and unique things that are out there, right?
exactly.
You, in and of yourself, you've lived in some pretty serious culinary locations, right? St. Louis has its own vibe. New Orleans has its own vibe. New York has a vibe. Georgia has a vibe. And when you start blending those things together, and then you kind of come out with a palette just from day to day eating, and you want to select a whiskey, you've got this really broad thing to kind of pull from. And that came from you specifically, right? And so, tying your identity, tying your flavor profile, your palate, all of those things directly to it brings us something that is going to be new and unique. And that's what most of the people that listen to this podcast are after, because we're not buying, we are probably buying, large scale bottles of wild turkey. So that way we have something to give our friends when they show up
Right.
that
Exactly. When they
you
say,
don't want to
I
give
don't
them.
really like whiskey, and you give them the
Right.
first one, I still don't like it. Well, you can just drink wild turkey for the rest of the
Exactly.
night.
Yeah. I mean, we're going to give you a few to try to expand your palate a little bit, and then
Yes,
you can go make your whiskey and cokes, and it's perfectly fine. I mean, we all drink the whiskey the way we want to, but I want to make sure that this is intentional. So,
which I would say
um,
New Dawn and Dr. Pepper. It's a thing I like.
look, you just said
I
Dr. Pepper. That's all you've got to say for me, right? It's and I don't know if you know this, but Dr. Pepper is not a flavor, right? It's a guy who said, I want it to sort of
Yes,
taste like this, and they had to put a whole bunch of stuff together to make it work
right?
like it doesn't naturally exist. But it's phenomenal. Like, that's what's there's a cup over here that's got Dr. Pepper in it, right? And I try not to drink soda a lot, because if
Yeah,
I'm gonna drink
same,
my
same.
I'm gonna drink my calories, it's gonna be through a bottle of whiskey, right?
That-
Instead of
that-
that, but
I'm You're speaking the truth.
I drink a lot of a lot of mineral water because
Yeah,
I do like carbonation. I don't even really like mineral water; it just kind of gets that soda trick out of me a little bit, so that way I
because
can
I don't
have
like
this.
water, so I'm like, you might as well add some bubbles to it to make it fun.
Right? Yeah, 100%, 100%. So, so let's talk about the flavor profiles, right? So
Yep.
you tasted through a whole bunch of samples. You found one that you liked. Were you looking for a profile, or were you looking for an experience? Were you looking for a mouthfeel? Like, how did you set out for how you wanted it to go?
I will say I make that's such a great question. And I want to like make sure. So I will say I perhaps started out with experience first and foremost,
Mhm,
in that I was like, if I come out with something, if I'm going to do this, then I know that I want it to be something both celebratory, I will say,
mhm,
but super high quality. I always am telling people I'm bougie. Or I'm telling my husband, I'm expensive because I don't know how I do it. If you're going to put things in front of me, don't show me the price. It's like magic. I'll be like, that's the most expensive. And that's the
mhm,
one I want. You know what I mean? It's always going to be the most expensive. That's the one I want. And so I wanted to essentially try to capture that expensive.
mhm,
um, but then it was like, okay, so here's the where I'm going. We're not partying, drinking. We're not tailgating at an IU football game with this one and everything. This is the one that we're sipping on, we're enjoying by the fire. Because at the time, I was, when I first had this nugget of I'm going to open a distillery. It's like, yeah, we're going to be sitting by the fire, in the winter and all of that,
mhm,
or we'll be out in the summer. Later on, it was like out in the summer, maybe not sipping it straight, maybe we'll be with an ice cube, maybe we'll throw in a cocktail and everything, but
mhm,
it's like always sipping with friends and family. That was the other thing, because that's sort of my, how I was brought up as it relates to alcohol. It was a great deal around friends and family getting together,
mhm,
you know that kind of thing. But then when it came down to the flavor profile, I was really specific too, that I wanted bold. I wanted to be cast strength. It had to be cast strength because I am a convert. I feel like that is the way you give people the most flexibility. There's nothing more frustrating to me these days when I do decide I want to have a cocktail and you're making it with something that's not cast strength, and then the flavors, because I cook and
mhm,
bake and all of that. And so it's like, oh, won't this be amazing? These flavors together. And then it's lost because it couldn't stand up to adding, some juice or a little sugar or whatever. So I wanted it to be bold, cast strength. I had this thought that I wanted them to be richer then, not thin. It's kind of how it was, but I wanted them to be richer in taste. And then it was kind of like, well, I like, I'll say, I want to, yeah, I'll say fruity, juicy, but not
Mhm.
sugary. That was a thing. And then the last thing was like sort of like interesting flavor notes, make it unexpected. And
Mhm.
so with the bourbon, which, well, I'll say the bourbon and the wheated, they really did come together. It was that wheated does not taste like a wheated to me at all. And I am like I said, I said no wheated. And when I got it and I'm sitting in front of it, I'm like, my God, it's so dark. I get that it's 10 years old, but it's like super dark. It doesn't taste like a wheated at all. It's very, very smooth. The heat on it and everything, because it is cast strength, it's like it washes across your tongue. And so that immediately started getting, so if you get when you get a bottle, the bottle will say the vibe. And
Mhm.
that is playing into that vibe, is it's just like this journey. You are like totally in the moment with this whiskey. Same thing with the bourbon, where it was like very rich. It was the most popular one with the friends, and everybody would just be like, even the people who were like, I don't like whiskey and everything, they would be like, oh, but it smells so, and that was what it was. It just like immediately gets you in the nose, and it smells so amazing. And so even if you don't like whiskey, you are like, oh, this amazing, and then you taste it, and it's like it tastes like it smells, and it's again that smooth, that cast strength isn't clabbering you over the head and all of that. And so it's like all of that just sort of came together to be like, these are the ones.
And I appreciate the wheat whiskey thing, right? Because I'm in a place where usually a younger wheat whiskey is fruity, but it's also really sweet, right? So
Yeah.
it gives you the I feel like I'm going to get diabetes drinking it, but there's something that happens, at least in my experience, after about year 8, where wheat whiskey starts to get a little more kind of oomph to it, right? And it feels, I don't know, like a really really well aged Armagnac makes you feel, right? The Armagnac.
I'm gonna have to try that focus of like 8 year or older, because I like I said, up until last year and a
Mhm.
half, I would have been like, absolutely not, you can't convince me. And so this was only because it was a blind tasting. But
Mhm.
okay, I'm gonna go out and look for some
It's
8 year and older.
that's my experience. So it's
I
the
mean,
thing that I get wrapped up in is like tasting notes are oftentimes bullshit, because what I taste and what you taste will be very
yes,
different, right?
they're gonna be wildly different.
Right,
Yes.
because banana for you may be a banana and it may be banana runts for me, right? And those things are not the same flavor, but they're a banana
Yes.
flavor, right? And it's the easiest one to use. But I like the thought that this is a communal spirit, right? Because that's what whiskey is about. Whiskey, vodka is speed pours into cocktails in a bar.
Exactly.
Rum is very much the same thing. Maybe not speed pours, but like frozen drinks and on the beach or whatever. And maybe you're alone, maybe you're with people, but whiskey is about people, about being
Yes.
around people, and kind of expanding that into cocktails and being cocktail forward. Is great because it kind of makes the dining room table bigger, right? Because you have
Yes.
more people that can kind of join you, and you and your brand make cocktail creation like a significant part of your brand's expression, specifically with culturally inspired drinks. How do you see that continue, and how hard is that to kind of make those two things go together?
It's not, so part of the reason, like I said, with the 6 year bourbon, it was the one that was more broadly in the tasting group that we were with. I will say it was sort of like your connoisseurs and whatever were like, oh my gosh, this weeded is amazing and whatever. And the sort of
Mhm.
general whatever was, okay, it's the 6 year, but everybody like came together. And so it really, the whole cocktail thing sort of started out as I was still waiting for bottles, if you will, of, the spirit to like to be bottled and all that. And so I had, a couple of unlabeled bottles and whatever. And it's like, how do you demonstrate this or talk to people about it?
Mhm.
And then was like, well, we'll make a couple of cocktails with it. And then I'll actually say it was the marketing team was like, you should have a signature cocktail for the drop and everything. And I sort of went back to my experience as it related to like cooking and baking. During the pandemic, I was one of those people. I like took an online class and learned how to like come up with my own cookie and cake recipe. So then it
Mhm.
was like, oh, this is just an extension of that part of myself, and like, what can we do with this whiskey? I don't know. We're coming up on a year in June. I don't know if I'll continue with the regularity of it. I'm not saying there's so many cocktails out there, but I also am becoming a more like, I'll say, intentional about it, even where I'm like, what I really want to share with people are this cocktail, this pairing together is the most phenomenal. Sort of
Mhm.
shifting more towards, I'm only going to put out signature cocktails. And those are harder to create for me at times than just let me try this cocktail recipe that I saw or recreate it and everything. So
Mhm.
coming up with your own, because I think that that's really what makes New Dawn special, is when I can say these flavors specifically are pairing and marrying most beautifully with this particular bourbon. And you'll even see with the 10-year, I hardly ever make, I can't bring myself, like every time I pour it, I'm like, what? We're going to add? No, we're not. And that's not to say you can't. I did stumble on, because I have for this month, the month of, what is this? May, April. For the month of April, I got inspired to do sort of garden party cocktails. And
Mhm.
so we had this sparkling wine cocktail that has rose in it, and tried it with the bourbon. With the bourbon, it's good. But with the wheat, because the wheat is a little bit of a cleaner, whatever, it like pops up the rose, but then the wheat, it just plays so beautifully with, because it's like all the flavors from the wheat are like amplified and all of
Mhm.
that. So I was like, all right, this is one cocktail with I'll make with this wheat. And adding that one to this one, it was totally an accident. I was just kind
Mhm.
of like, oh, I picked up the wrong bottle, like my wrong tasting bottle and whatever. So
I do enjoy that, right? And there's no wrong way to drink whiskey, but
no,
we and I feel comfortable saying you and I are very similar in this. We're a little bit precious about our whiskey, and we're gonna make sure that the right whiskey is the one that goes into the cocktail, and not the one that is the full experience on its
exactly.
own, right? But a cocktail can be elevated to the next level with the appropriate ingredient,
Exactly.
regardless of what its price point is or what its expectation is. And that's, I love to see that. I love to see the kind of the growth of not just catering to the people who want to drink it at cask strength in a glass with no ice and nothing else. And I'm that person. Like I am the market for that all day long. But I'm not the only person, right? And we want our table to be big and diverse, and that's one of the ways to do it. Um, so let's talk a little bit about it, and I think we've touched on it briefly, but we're getting pretty deep into this. Where can we be buying things, right? So I think you
Yeah.
mentioned online, and what's in the market right now.
Yes. So we are online in 43 states, I think it is, mostly the alcohol control states. I am active. Let's see, we're in Illinois right now, in store on shelves at Super Lucky Liquor, Food and Liquor. I think it is Food and Liquor, and Urbana or Champaign Urbana. Um, we are also at Park Avenue, Park, is that Park Avenue Liquor Store? I feel like, yes, Park Avenue's liquor store in New York. Um, Distribution to Illinois should be expanding out shortly, and also like it's like this close as it relates to Michigan, friends, which I've been working on since I did Taste of Black Spirits last fall and everything. And then I am hoping, if not by June, well, I shouldn't say by June. I'll say if not by May, then definitely by June, to be in Texas and Louisiana. We're just refining some distribution. Distribution is like the bane of my existence. I would like literally everybody who I want to say, who says to me, I only buy my alcohol in stores. And I really just want to be like, I hear you, but also you have no idea how much you're missing out on. And it's not because I don't want to be in your store. I 100% want to be in your store, but I can't get a distributor to bring it to your store. Like, you want to talk about wisdom and lessons? I really wish somebody had sat me down and talked about. If they had, though, I probably wouldn't have done this. The 3-tier system. I'd have been like, "Say what? I can't just like, here, take this bottle. I have to go through this middleman. I have to. Okay, I guess." And When you get one, it works. But when you're
Mhm.
like, I'm trying to find a distributor, and they're like not returning your calls, and you're like, but people want it.
Mhm. The 3 tier of all of the people I've had the benefit of talking to through this whole thing, I've yet to find anybody. Well, I take that back. I found one person who was like, "I understand why the 3 tier system exists." Everybody else is like, "Man, this thing sucks. I wish this shit would go away." Like
Yes.
it is
Yeah.
it is specifically difficult for smaller brands, for launching brands to kind of navigate those waters and get to the markets where people will buy it, right? Because
Yeah.
there's a wide berth of people that want to purchase new and unique things, and they're spread out all over the United States, and making that more difficult is not helpful in any form or fashion. So those are the places you can buy it. What do we have in either online or in stores that it is purchasable right now?
Yes. So we've got the 6-year-old bourbon that's available for purchase at both in Illinois and New York in store and online, and the 10 years available online and in Illinois. So both products are available. There's plenty in stock in both places. So I want to be like, even online, go ahead and get you some. Online, we have a deal if you get 2 bottles. So if you want to get one of each and everything, but 2 bottles comes with free shipping. And free shipping, for considering some of the other alcohol sales, is not too bad. It's $14.99. I
Mhm.
know I was aiming to buy some product of a friend's, and it was like $25, and I was like, "Girl, that's like half the price."
Right. But then you just start looking at, okay, how many bottles can I add to the shipment
Yes,
to maximize it? And they're like, oh, you can add 3 more bottles and it stays $25. And you're like, you
right.
know what
And
they're
you're
doing
like,
now. They're
"Okay, suddenly got a case. Fine."
Yeah, that's
Twist my arm.
we definitely need more stuff on the shelf here in our homes for sure. I'm quite sure of that. Um, do you have anything coming up as far as either events or releases that people need to be aware of so that way they can make sure they see you out in the market?
Yeah, so I will be in Dallas doing a tasting event with Black and Bourbon in May. Oh, I'm not gonna remember the dates of that um, off the top of my head, but if you go to Black and Bourbon's website, I'm sure they have that posted. I'll be at Taste of Black Spirits Brooklyn in June, and Clink Festival, which I think is going to be in September. We have pressed pause on the release of our rye for the moment, so I will tell everybody look for that come 2026. I was super excited about that one. Like, it's got these beautiful tropical notes going on for it, and it comes out of California. Again, it was one of those, wait, what? Where is this coming from? This is insane. I will be really excited to be able to put that out next year. And then if you follow us online, both website or any of our socials, we're always posting upcoming tasting events where you guys can come out and check things out. Hopefully, I will be in Illinois too sometime this early summer to do some tastings.
So, and maybe a couple last questions before we're running up on the end of time. What if you were to look, kind of 5 to 7 to 10 years in the future? Are you attempting? Are we trying to build a really solid boutique brand? Are you trying to like world domination? Like, where are you going with New Dawn?
The answer is always world domination. I have been saying I want to take over the world since I was a kid. Like, and then Pinky and the Brain came out, and you're like,
Hmm.
yes, people who understand me. I will say, well, I mean, especially since my husband is Turkish and I have a lot of family overseas, I would love to see New Dawn overseas. Somebody just put in my head that I could just essentially treat, apparently duty free is like any other retailer. So it's like saying what? So I need to look into all of that. But yeah, I would say really solid boutique brand over the next 5 years. I'd like to, and I say boutique brand for whiskeys, and I'd like to add mezcals to the portfolio. I know they're starting to pick up now, but there is, I guess I'll say, there are so many more agave than you ever dreamed of in your entire life. It's more like wine, and they all taste different. So it's like, we talk about varietals of grapes, there are varietals of mezcal, of agave, that mezcal, and then methods of how mezcal is made. And I just really like, similar to whiskey, it's all about the craftsmanship there and the, like, oh my God, like it really feels like community. Same sort of, we're not shooting this. Yeah, you could put it in a cocktail if you want, but it really is a matter of sipping, going through the flavors.
Mhm.
And, for me, the thing that got me into whiskey where you're like smelling and you're like, oh my God, taste this, and handing it off to your friend and everything. Like that's what I want to be creating more of that culture through Moscal.
So, and this will be, I swear this is the last question, right? So you mentioned, if someone had told you about the 3-tier system a long time ago, maybe you wouldn't have made it to the point to where you are now. You might have kind of, looking backwards, thinking about that. What is some advice that you would give to yourself 3 to 5 years from now, in the hopes of staving off anything else like that from happening? Do you have any advice for yourself for the future?
Advice for myself? I mean, that's I would probably just say slow and steady. And it's like a reminder that I give myself all the time. Because even with the three, like everything is surmountable, but it has to be slow and steady. And you will run into challenges, but you just have to be like, okay, how do we navigate this? I probably would tell myself and maybe like I'm like sitting here thinking to myself, yeah, Dawn, you should do that right now, which is find more people thinking outside the box, because all of the small craft brands that are out there, they're thinking outside the box, and those are the people I think that are really going to revolutionize the industry and bring us really quality products. That's what's going to happen. People who are on that same narrow, I have to do it the same way. No, you don't, and you're not going to succeed. You got to be thinking
Mhm.
outside the box.
That's pretty phenomenal, and I've read the phrase, and I don't remember, it was one of those, like, you work in business, you have to read these 5 books because that's what everybody else in business is reading or whatever, and the phrase is slow is smooth and smooth is fast, right? And so
Yeah.
that's right in that vein of wisdom that everybody is, subconsciously noted, I think, and so I think it's some solid advice to give yourself for the future. Dr. ONeal, thank you so much for giving me
Thank you.
time. It's the one thing you can't create more of. If there's anything else that you want to share with folks before we hit the end of this recording, now's your chance. If not, thank you.
I just want to say thank you for having me. It was a lot of fun. I always enjoy talking to new people, new questions that are like, oh, I didn't think about that. Now I gotta go think, what else would I tell myself
Hmm.
down the line? But yeah, I really appreciate it. I hope everybody gets a chance to try New Dawn. It really is some high quality whiskey. I want to be like, I wouldn't put out anything less.
Right.
Again, remember I'm bougie.
You're not going to have your name literally on the bottle and then put out something bad.
Exactly, exactly. But that was also an accident. Like the name of the company was supposed to be Second Son, and
Hmm.
they were like, "You can't do that because Second Son sounds too much like SON." And there's a distilling company called that. So then I had to go back to we had a group brainstorm, and that's the one
Hmm.
that bubbled to the top. And I was like, I guess it works.
Trademark branding is a pain. It's not quite at the
It is.
3-tier level, but it's pretty difficult. So, like I
Yeah.
said, thank you very much for hopping on with me.
Thank you. Thank you. It's good to talk to you.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode from the Embellish Podcast. If you enjoyed this, please leave me a review on whatever platform that you're consuming this on, and leave a comment if it is at all possible. Hit me up on social media, on TikTok or Instagram at Embellish Pod, and give me a follow so you can keep up with what's going on here. I have a website. It is www.embellishpod.com. It's a place to pick up all of my links, accounts, contact details, and more. Thanks for stopping by.